The PlayStation Vita and the Nintendo Switch, two handheld consoles worlds apart, one at the end of its life cycle, the other just beginning. So what's the link between the two and why are they the subject of this video? Well, you see, both the Nintendo Switch and now recently the PlayStation Vita are easily exploitable. Neither system requires any hardware modifications, and now thanks to a simple method, you can play emulators and Homebrew on both systems. Now both the Switch and the PS Vita have excellent Homebrew and emulator support for their respective systems. But if we could only choose one system, which one would win the Homebrew Wars? So, we're going to compare the PlayStation Vita with the Nintendo Switch for Homebrew. Now, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about playing backups or anything like that. Obviously, both systems have really good original games that you can play and you can use, and you can play backups on both systems with modded devices. So let's go ahead and see the comparison of Homebrew between the PlayStation Vita and the Nintendo Switch. Before we start comparing Homebrew, it's important to compare the technical specs of both handhelds. On the left we have the Nintendo Switch. Released in 2017 and coming in at $299, the NVIDIA Tegra X1 chip powers the system. It has a quad-core CPU with a clock speed of 1020 MHz. It has 4 GB of system memory, and the GPU has a dock speed of 700 MHz and an undocked speed of 307.2. The Nintendo Switch runs at a native resolution of 1280 by 720 or 720p. The PlayStation Vita was released in 2011. On average, you can pick them up for between $100 and $150 on the used market these days. The CPU is a quad-core ARM A9 processor with a default clock at 333 MHz, but can be boosted up to 444 MHz. Its GPU is the PowerVR SGX 543. It has 512 MB of system memory and runs at a native 16:9 resolution of 960 by 544. According to VG charts, the Vita has sold about 16 million consoles, while the Switch, only into its second year, has already surpassed it at 18 million. Both systems have readily available modding methods. The Switch has the RCM jig method with a tethered payload, while the PlayStation Vita has the latest H-Encore or Hencore exploit for those people running the latest firmware. So now that we've seen the specs of both the handhelds, let's get into it.
Round 1. Fight!
First up, the Nintendo Switch. For 8 and 16-bit consoles, the Nintendo Switch has you covered with excellent emulation. While there are dedicated emulators for NES, Super NES and Game Boy Advance, a port of RetroArch to the Nintendo Switch, which is known as Retro NX, is really beginning to hit its stride. It contains libretro cores for all these systems and more, which we will talk about shortly. And if we're talking about Sega Genesis emulation, it utilizes the Genesis Plus GX core, but sadly there doesn't so far seem to be any Sega CD or 32X compatibility. For PlayStation 1, recently the PCSX Reloaded emulator has had significant improvements. While not perfect, many games now run at full speed or close to it. Some games still run with some slowdown however, but this core has a ton of interest behind it currently. It's also running under interpreted mode, so with the addition of a dynamic recompiler will really help bring out performance in almost all the games that it's compatible with. On the arcade side, the best option still is PFBA, the port of Final Burn Alpha. This runs very well, has excellent CPS3 performance, which is very impressive under the Nintendo Switch because CPS3, generally speaking, has trouble with slower processors. And one final word about emulators under the Nintendo Switch. Under the Horizon OS and the Homebrew development tools out there, at this time there is no 3D graphics API that developers can utilize. What this means to the end user is the next level of emulators such as Nintendo 64, GameCube, and Sega Dreamcast are not currently possible until that graphics API is made available. But even still, things are off to an amazing start, and I can only see emulation continue to improve for the Nintendo Switch. With that said, let's take a look at the PlayStation Vita. The PlayStation Vita is no slouch in the emulation department. Even with the 333MHz processor, it is very impressive. As with the Nintendo Switch, it can play NES, Super NES, Game Boy Advance, and Sega Genesis games all at excellent performance as you would expect. RetroArch is also available for the device, and it comes with Pico Drive, which supports Sega 32X and Sega CD and Mega CD games. 32X does not run at full speed, however, with some slowdown and dips. Where the PlayStation Vita really struggles compared to the Switch, however, is arcade emulation. PFBA is also available on the Vita and runs at lower performance. For example, System 16 games like Space Harrier really struggle. And as you can see, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles runs at about 80% performance. RetroArch arcade performance is even worse, requiring a certain amount of processing power, and the Vita sadly does not have enough. But it's not all bad news. There are some emulators out for the Vita that aren't available currently for the Nintendo Switch, and I'm talking about UAE for All. This is the Amiga emulator, and it runs exceptionally well at full speed on every single game that I've thrown at it to date. And this is an awesome way to play Amiga games on a portable handheld system. And also, we have to talk about the secret weapon of the PlayStation Vita, which is Adrenaline. This software transforms the PlayStation Vita into a fully working PSP for playing all those PSP and PS1 games. This software is awesome, and there's new developments as we speak to support PlayStation 1 multiplayer games with DualShock 3 and 4 controllers.
Round 2. Fight!
Homebrew ports for the Nintendo Switch have all the staples here you would expect to see: Doom, Prince of Persia, Open Tyrion, Open Beats of Rage, and more. My ports of Chocolate Doom, Cannonball, and Postal all run very well and have been well received. I've recently updated Chocolate Doom to add music and fix input lag issues, and Chocolate Doom on the Switch is a good way to enjoy the original Doom. There are other homebrew ports of Another World, Flashback, and Heart of the Alien. Flashback, incidentally, has had a proper retail release. For me, the biggest standout has to be eDuke 32, which is the port of Duke Nukem 3D, running very well and supporting widescreen modes. OpenBOR or Beats of Rage is a fun engine to play around with, and of course, ScumVM is essential on every device out there. Let's go ahead and check out and see what's available on the PlayStation Vita. Now this is one area where the Vita wins over the Nintendo Switch. The homebrew ports available for the system is simply amazing. Like the Switch, the Vita has ScumVM, Cannonball, Another World, Flashback, and Chocolate Doom all running exceptionally well on the system. But because the Vita has a 3D graphics accelerated API available to it, means that it has some ports that the Switch does not, yet. Hexen 2 is one of those examples that's exclusive to the Vita at this time. Quake 3 is another game that runs very well. It's also possible to play online, which is awesome and a ton of fun. AM2R, another Metroid 2 remake, is also exclusive to the Vita, and if you're a fan of this homebrew remake, you'll absolutely love the Vita version. And then of course there's Half-Life, running on the PlayStation Vita. Think about that for a second. Homebrew ports is really where the Vita shines over the Switch, and I've only scratched the surface of what's out. So what's your favourite homebrew Vita port? Let me know in the comments below. Now with the ability for the Vita to have OpenGL as an API that homebrew developers can tap into, we've already seen some extremely impressive ports to the PlayStation Vita. And I'm talking about things like Quake 3, Hexen 2, and Fade to Black. All those games support and require 3D rendering APIs like OpenGL.
Round 3. Fight!
Last, but certainly not least, is utilities. Right now, this isn't really a fair contest. The Vita is very well established with excellent utilities. Some standouts for me is Vita Shell, a file manager that has a ton of features including FTP, the ability to install VPK files, mount USB devices, and memory cards. The Vita Homebrew browser is an easy way to browse and install new Homebrew, and there's also many other utilities like theme managers. There's also a PSP specific Homebrew browser that allows you to download and install the latest PSP Homebrew and run it under Adrenaline. You can also download custom themes to make your Vita really pop. The Nintendo Switch, on the other hand, is only getting started. It has a useful file manager known as NX Shell. There's also a dedicated FTP program known as FTPD, but what would be very useful is to incorporate an FTP server into a file manager like Vita Shell does. NX Play is an early adopted media player that's in development. I'll be interested to see where this goes. The Switch would be great as a media player, and I'd love to see more being done in this category. And finally, App Store NX is a graphical front-end App Store downloader great for managing and downloading Homebrew for the Nintendo Switch. So, in conclusion, if I had to pick one, which one would it be? Look, I would say the PlayStation Vita today is the preferred console or the preferred handheld that I would use for Homebrew. And the reasons for that is because currently the Nintendo Switch is still very much early on in its development phase, and one big elephant in the room, which I know is being addressed, is that there is no 3D acceleration API for the Homebrew libraries that are available for the Nintendo Switch. Now that is coming, I know that for a fact that is coming, and once that does arrive, then we'll see the floodgates open with, Nintendo 64 emulator, Dreamcast emulation is potential, GameCube, stuff like that, really will bring into the next level of emulators that will run on the Nintendo Switch. But as it stands today, the PlayStation Vita has a much more comprehensive spread of Homebrew emulators and utilities that you can use. But look, honestly guys, I'm not telling you to buy a PlayStation Vita over a Nintendo Switch or a Switch over a Vita. At the end of the day, either one of these choices is a fantastic reason to pick one up if you want to play Homebrew and emulators on the go. Both systems obviously are very, very solid, and there's so much more to come in both systems, especially now that the Vita has been busted open with the latest revisions. Now you can exploit any revision PlayStation Vita that you like. And obviously the Nintendo Switch, with the simplicity of the RCM jig, makes it a very appealing choice, as I mentioned, in a previous video, for Homebrew developers to start looking into. Well guys, I'm going to leave it at that for this video. Let me know what you thought about the Homebrew wars between the PlayStation Vita and the Nintendo Switch in the comments below. If you had any questions about what you saw, hit me up and I'll be happy to respond. As always guys, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.